All right, so we are going to graph. This says graph the function and identify each characteristic. Really what we need to do is identify the characteristics in order to graph. So the identifying the characteristics part is what we did yesterday, so we should be able to handle that. From this one right here, what's my amplitude? 2. What's the frequency? 1. The period is 2 pi. Good, since the frequency is 1. Do I have a vertical shift? No, so that's 0, which means the midline is y equals 0. Okay? So these first two are going to be super easy, just one with an amplitude and one with a shift, and then we'll get them all together. So remember, you have to draw your little parent function here. This is cosine, so one cycle of cosine starting at 0 would look something like that for my parent function. And that gives me 5 anchor points. Okay. The first thing I want to do on my graph is my midline. Midline is at y equals 0, so it's still just the x-axis. Okay. We are not shifting left and right yet, so whatever is on the x-axis would still be on the x-axis. I just got to figure out where on the x-axis it would be. Since my amplitude is 2, on the parent function, I'd go from here up 1, but the amplitude's 2. So from the midline, which happens to be the axis, I go up 2, and that takes care of this point right here. Okay, so I've done that one. The next thing you want to do is the end of your period, which will have the same y value that you just plotted, but in the way you know where it goes at the end of the period. The period's at 2 pi, so there's the beginning and the end. Then everything else is half, half, half every single time. So halfway between these two, from the midline, I would go down 2 to get this point. Well, halfway between 0 and 2 pi is pi. So from the midline, I go down 2. That gives me that point. Then halfway between these 2 points, I'm going to have a 0 on the midline. So halfway between 0 and pi is pi halves. That's this point. Then halfway between these two, between pi and 2 pi, it's going to be 3 pi halves. And there's that 0. There's your 5 anchor points. Once you've got your 5 anchor points on there, sometimes you can't get all 5. We'll look at some of those. But once you got all the anchor points on there, you can. Then it just repeats because it's a periodic function, right? So I have a y value of 2 every 2 pi units. Halfway between that, I'd be down here at -2, and then these are my zeros. Okay. Then when you sketch it in, I'm going to try and make these look semi-decent, so I'm going to have to stand in front of it for a minute. It is not, do not make it zigzaggy. It is curvy. Everything is smooth. No zigzags. It's not an art class, but you have to make an attempt. Also, the arrows on the end, notice that they curve back down. That shows me you understand what's happening in the graph. If you make it shoot off to Neverland like this, that tells me you have no idea what's really going on, because it's not a polynomial. What questions you got? Easy enough? No matter how you stretch, shrink, move, flip, whatever, everything is happening proportionally. So if you can get the beginning and the end and half, 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 you got it down, okay? So let's do one that has a shift, and then we'll do some that mix it all up. All right, so on number 2, what's my amplitude? 1. My frequency is 1, so the period is 2 pi. I do have a vertical shift. That's a +4. So my midline, y equals 4. Sketch my little parent function here. There's 5 anchor points here. I have 3 that are zeros on the midline, and then 2 that would use the amplitude. First thing I'm going to graph is my midline, which is at y equals 4. So it's up here. Now I'm going to use my midline as my new x-axis. That way I'm not having to count up 4. Like, that's now my x-axis. So if I'm thinking of this as 0, 0, this is my new 0, 0. Make sense? Because everything just shifted up 4. That's the beginning of the period. The end of the period is at 2 pi, and it's also a 0 on the midline. So at 2 pi, I'm right here. Then halfway between the two is another 0 on the midline, which is right here. So I got the 3 zeros taken care of. Halfway between the first two, I have an amplitude that goes up from the midline. My amplitude is 1, so halfway between these two from the midline, I go up 1. Halfway between these two from the midline, I go down 1. And there are my 5 anchor points. Good? Then I just repeat them. So if I was doing this, I would get all of I would just do these first. Just work in whatever your pattern is that makes the most sense to you. Okay. And again, curvy, not zigzaggy. What questions do you have? We good? All right, so let's look at number 3. What's my amplitude at number 3? Well, 5 halves, yes. So 5 halves is my amplitude because it's just the absolute value of A. My frequency is 2. So what is the period? Pi. Good, because remember that the period is 2 pi divided by the frequency. That's where you get the pi from. I have a vertical shift of -1, which means my midline, y equals -1. This is a sine function. So my little parent function looks like this. I've got 5 anchor points here. First thing I want to graph is my midline. That's at y equals -1. That is my new x-axis. We're not shifting left or right yet, so this is 0, 0. That's going to be 0, 0 using the midline right there. The next point I do is the end of the period. This period is pi, so this point goes here on the midline at pi. It's important that it's best for you to actually do these in the same order every single time so that you don't lose track of which point that is you just plotted that's over here. Beginning, end, middle, 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 right? So halfway between these two is another 0 on the midline. So halfway between 0 and pi is pi halves, so that's that one. So there are my 3 zeros. Halfway between the first two, I go up from the midline, my amplitude, which is 5 halves, which is like 2.5. So halfway between these two, from the midline, I go up 1, 2.5. Halfway between these two, from the midline, I'm going to go down the amplitude. So halfway between these two, from the midline, I go down 2.5. Those are your 5 anchor points. And you can see that x is still lying because that's sine of 2x, so it looks like I should be doubling it, should be getting bigger, but it's actually getting squished together because it's still a horizontal compression. So now that I have this, I'm going to repeat it. So I would put in all my zeros first because it's just a 0, skip, 0, skip. So it's pretty easy to just follow that pattern. I mean, you can do it however you want. Just be consistent and make sure it's where it's supposed to be. And then you just alternate above and below, halfway between. Once you get this one sketched in, you can go. Any questions about that? right, we're going to do a couple more together before I let you do some on your own. All right, so let's look at number 4. What is the amplitude here? 5. What is the frequency? 1/2. Good. Which means the period is what? 4 pi. Very good. Because the period is equal to 2 pi divided by the frequency. So that becomes 2 pi times 2 over 1, and that's where you get that 4 pi from. Okay? All right. Do I have a vertical shift? No. So my midline is y equals 0. All right, so I'm going to sketch my little parent function here. Oh, I'm sorry. I meant to give you this. You should sign that. Cosine looks like this. All right, my 5 anchor points. Then midline is y equals 0. That in there. Okay. So this point is for my parent function. That's at 0, 1. But I know I'm just going to go from wherever the midline is up whatever the amplitude is. The amplitude's 5. So from the midline, which happens to be the axis, I go up 5. Hit that right there. Okay. Then I would do the end. The end of this is at 4 pi. I can't graph that on the graph, but I need to know it's at 4 pi, right? It's out here somewhere. It wouldn't make any sense for me to put a point. So fine, I can't put it on there. But then I have to think about where that is, because the next thing I'm going to do is halfway between the two for this one. Halfway between the two is where? 2 pi, right? Halfway. So at 2 pi, from the midline, I would go down whatever my amplitude is. So if I couldn't get this point on there, this is at 2 pi, I'm not going to get that one on there either, and that's fine. But I can get this one, which will be on the midline, halfway between the two, where? At pi. So in this case, I only got 3 of the 5 anchor points, but you know the shape of the graph doesn't change, right? You know what's happening with it, so could you plot the other points that are on the negative x-axis? Yes. So where would I have another 0? Negative pi. And what would be happening at negative 2 pi? Down pi, exactly. And so this is just a very stretched out curve. Oh, I gotta shift it. I can't. Questions? We good on that? Half, half, half. And you may need to label something on here to, figure out where your halves are if you can't actually get it on the graph. We're good? Awesome. Let's look at number 5. My amplitude here is 2. What's the frequency? 8/3. So the period would be what? Period is 2 pi divided by 8/3. So that is 2 pi times 3/8, 3 pi fourths. 3 pi fourths. I do not have a vertical shift, so my midline is y equals 0. So I'm going to sketch my little cosine over here so I have something to follow. Get my midline in there, which is at 0, so there you go. All right, so this first point, from the midline, I go up whatever the amplitude is. So from the midline, amplitude is 2. That takes care of that first point right there. Then I need the end. Well, the period is 3 pi fourths. Can you figure out where 3 pi fourths is on this axis? You think fractionally just like you did on the unit circle. If this, yes, because if this is pi halves, right? So this is pi fourths. So this is 1 pi fourth, 2 pi fourth, 3 pi fourths, 4 pi fourths, right? It's the same thinking as around there. So this is 3 pi fourths, and I would be up here at that same y value. So I have the beginning and the end. Then halfway between the two, because this is at 3 pi fourths, halfway between the two from the midline, I would go down the amplitude. So I can figure out where halfway between the two is right here, and I'm going to go down 2. Now, it's okay that I don't know what the actual x value is, but you should be able to very easily know what the x value is. So just tell me, what would this x value be? What's half of 3 pi fourths? Dude, 4th grade fractions is what's just going to kill y'all for the rest of your math lives if you can't tell me what half of 3 pi fourths is quickly. How would you find half of it? What could you multiply it by to find half of it? You would divide it by 2. What would you multiply it by? 1/2. Half of something means 1/2 times that thing. What's half of 3 pi fourths? There you go. See how easy that is? That's literally all you have to do. You have to be able to think that way. Okay? Fractions are never going away in your math. Never, ever. And if you still struggle with all that, you're going to get stuck on stuff. You'll be able to do the hard stuff and not do the fraction stuff. That's scary. Okay, so it's at 3 pi eighths. Not that I needed to know that in this case, but there are times when you do need to know that. All right, so then I need to go halfway between these 2 points, right? Halfway between these 2 points. So just go ahead and tell me, what would that x value be? My head's going to explode if you can't tell me, because it's easy. Half of 3 pi eighths is what? Thank you. You just multiply by 1/2. It's 3 pi over 16. Make sense? That's how you find half of anything. Multiply by 1/2. All right, so it's 3 pi 16. So not that I'm labeling it, but so halfway between these two. So really knowing that it's 3 pi 16 doesn't help me on here. What helps me on here is just understanding how halves work and how graphs work. So from here to here, that's 1.5 spaces. You agree with that? Half of 1.5 is 3/4, right? You got $1.50. You give me half of it. You got 75 cents left, right? 3/4. Okay, so I would go 3/4 of the way this direction. So I'd be kind of close to that line right there. And then going from this direction halfway, I'd be like 3/4 kind of right there. So it kind of hugs those lines. Kind of looks like a little panda bear face. Okay, we good? Those are your 5 anchor points. Half, half, half. Now we just repeat. Okay, so go ahead and fill in the rest of them to repeat it. Make sure you're hugging the right side of the correct side of the line. Something like that. And curvy, not zigzaggy. Not an art class, but it's obvious if you didn't even try to curve and you just zigzagged everything. And again, the arrows should be pointing back down. They don't shoot off to Never Never Land because that's not what's going on there. All right, what questions you got? Good? All right. So let's look at number 6. What is the amplitude? 3/2. Frequency is 1. Period is. Vertical shift is. And the midline is y equals 3. I'm on it today. All right, so you go ahead and you graph this one. So it looks like you've all at least got started on the right direction. So I'm going to go ahead and start talking you through it, even though you're not finished, because that way you can make sure you're right. Finishing up here. So I would start here at my new 0, 0, which is right here. Then I would go to the end of the period. The period is 2 pi, so I'm right here. Then I would go halfway in between, which is at pi. So I got those 3 zeros on there. Halfway between these two from the midline, I go up whatever the amplitude is. So halfway between these two from the midline, amplitude is 3/2, so I'd go up 1.5. That's this point. Halfway between these two, I'd go down 1.5. Those are my 5 anchor points. Any questions about where those came from? Okay, and then you just repeat them, and you've got your graph. Okay. Any questions at all on that one? All right. So let's find the important stuff here for number 7. Amplitude is 3. Frequency is 1/3. So what is the period? 6 pi. Very good. I have a vertical shift of 1. Midline, y equals 1. This is one where you're not going to be able to get all the anchor points on there. You're only going to be able to get 2 of them on there. But think about where they should be, see how far you can get, and then I will walk you through it. Okay, let's talk through this one. I know I'm going to start here at my midline 0, 0, which is this point right here. The period is 6 pi, so this would be at 6 pi, which is clearly way off my graph, right? Halfway between here and here, this would be 3 pi, right? Still off my graph, can't do it. But that's why I'm using this, because I can't really count over there. Halfway between these two, halfway between 0 and 3 pi is what? 3 pi halves. And thank you for actually saying it like that. I've heard 1.5 today, thought my head was going to explode. It's freaking radians, you know how to do it, right? 3 pi halves. So then also, because you have knowledge of the unit circle, you should know where 3 pi halves is on here. So we go 0, and then pi halves, pi, 3 pi halves, 2 pi, right? It's halfway between pi and 2 pi. That's your 3 pi halves. This is where I would go at 3 pi halves from my midline up whatever the amplitude is, which is 3. So I can only get 2 of the 5 anchor points on there, but because I know what the shape is, because it doesn't change, I can get only 1 more point on there, but I still know what it looks like, right? So I would go to negative 3 pi halves, and then from the midline, I'd go down 1, 2, 3. Always make sure it's from the midline and not from the x-axis, because that can lead to some bad things for you. It should look something like that. So see, x is lying. 1/3 looks like it should be a shrink, but it's at a horizontal stretch. We good? Any questions? All right, we're going to skip number 8 because it's similar to some of the other ones. I want to do number 9. My amplitude here is 4. Frequency is 2/3. So what does that make my period? 2 pi divided by 2/3, which is the same as 2 pi times 3/2. Ooh. I don't know what I'm writing there. 3/2. So what's my period? 3 pi. Vertical shift of -1, y equals -1. All right, here is my parent function for my cosine. We got these 5 points I need to take care of. Get my midline in there at y equals -1. So my amplitude is 4. I start on the y-axis. From the midline, I'm going to go up 4. So from the midline, I go up 1, 2, 3, 4. Boom, there's that. Then I want to do the end of the period, which is at 3 pi, which is off my graph. So I can't do that. Then the next thing I would do would be halfway in between. Halfway in between is where? 3 pi halves, exactly. So at 3 pi halves, from the midline, I would go down 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. Then halfway between these two, I'm going to have a 0 on my midline. What's half of 3 pi halves? Thank you. Yay! 3 pi fourths. See how easy that is? All right, so, and then 3 pi fourths is right there. Y'all are just scared of fractions. That's your problem. You try to avoid them. So I can only get 3 of the 5 anchor points on there. Maybe. I actually can get another one. If you look here, this is, I'm on the midline, then I have 2 lines. I'm down here, so I have 2 lines, and then guess what? I'm on the midline again, so I can actually get 4 of them. Then you can just repeat that over here. This is here, and there's your graph. If you have something to follow along over here, and you can think of half, 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 beginning, end, half, 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 you can totally do these, all right? Your assignment is on an actual piece of paper that is not going informative. You are going to hand this to me completed on Thursday when you come to class, all right? Do not get behind on this because we're going to keep graphing. We still have tangent to do. We still have all the reciprocals. We still have shifts. And if you put this off, you're going to get lost real quick, okay? So if you keep up with it, you'll be fine. If you procrastinate, that's bad, okay?